OpenAI and Google have amazed everyone this week with two massive announcements. Now, obviously, Google's announcement was a bit more exciting, at least in structure, but OpenAI's release was a little bit quieter. And although Google announced a bunch of really cool things, there has been a lot of milling about as to whether or not GPT-4o, OpenAI's latest release, is actually better than a lot of existing things from OpenAI. And with the recent departure of Ilya Sutskever and two other founding members of OpenAI, there are questions of whatever they saw or why they decided to leave at this time after what was supposed to be such a monumental release. Again, even if their demo and their event announcing this was just kind of weird. So I want to get into performance numbers, where GPT-4o is stacking up after some benchmarking compared to open source LLMs like LlaMa 3, LlaMa 2, and stuff from Mistral, even LlaMa 3 400B+ with its latest updates, how it compares to previous offerings from OpenAI and other companies like Anthropic's Claude. So welcome to AI Flux. Let's get into it. So we've been seeing some really interesting numbers released. A lot of people, I think, frame what GPT-4o is kind of incorrectly. For anyone who's curious, I would definitely go read up Marshall Technologies' report, basically stating that GPT-2 chatbot that showed up on LLM leaderboards last week was definitely just GPT-4o. There are clear indicators of this now. By rankings, it's pretty interesting, and the performance of GPT-4o is actually basically identical. And the other thing is, I think the framing of this should be that GPT-4o from OpenAI was just meant to really replace and destroy Perplexity AI as a competitor. The biggest edge Perplexity AI had, even though it's just built on top of a bunch of other APIs, one of which is actually the GPT-4 API from OpenAI, is that it would provide you with sourcing and a bit more information from the internet when you were looking for an answer about something. So it was a bit more engaging. It was a bit better at just telling you where it got its information from, which also meant that it hallucinated less often and generally gave you more well-referenced and context-based answers. And I think OpenAI now, at least with the search capability, has completely destroyed Perplexity. And of course, this is an ongoing pattern with OpenAI, which is every time OpenAI has a big announcement like this, there's an entire swath of startups that either get better because they're reasonably based wrappers around these tools, and then there are others that get entirely destroyed because OpenAI just decides that whatever products they're working on were good enough, they should just make that themselves, and then since these other tools are just wrappers on OpenAI's products, it doesn't look good for them going into the future. And unfortunately, Perplexity AI kind of ended up in this bucket this go around. And the other thing with GPT-4o is I don't think it was really supposed to be their most performant model. Initially, a lot of people were perplexed because they were trying to recreate the exact prompts in the demo, and they found that it just wasn't as good, and that in actually some cases it was struggling with basic code generation tasks that even GPT-4 Turbo could complete. And I don't think that's really what they were going for here. Of course, there are all the memes of OpenAI just wanted to recreate the AI from her. As much of a meme as that is, I think more of what they were trying to do was to optimize and get as close as possible as to creating the best interface with AI that exists. Text is great, but natural language is better, and the reason natural language has just been so cringe in the past or just hasn't worked as well is because it was just weird talking to an AI. And if the thing is, if you can make talking to an AI less weird, you also open up kind of more social skills to address bigger, kind of less technical skills. Like I think AI early on, especially with GPT-4 and really the earliest versions of ChatGPT that were available, it wasn't that you could talk to it and it felt like a person. It was more so that it could do things that we previously thought only people could do, coding being a specific one. I still vividly remember the week that me and a few friends got access to ChatGPT for the first time. And the first thing we tried to do was just to get it to code. And when it managed to do certain things that were actually pretty novel, that was an incredible moment. And what's cool is if ChatGPT can talk better, it's like teaching a software engineer how to have real social skills. You can unlock a whole nother level of interfacing and tasks that then these future agentic AIs can do. And to be clear, I don't consider GPT-4o really agentic in any capacity, very limited capacity for now. But the idea is now if it talks better and it talks effectively, and you can understand it more and it's just more conversational, there's a much better chance that you'll start replacing or being able to employ GPTs as product managers or as salespeople or as even more capable support representatives. And although, some people who watch this stuff don't really think we should be replacing people with this, for OpenAI, when they make money when more people are using their tools. So even if their model isn't more performant and it's not better for doing like discrete tasks, what's great here is if it's more conversational, if it's easier to interface with more people, and more people are like, oh, I might actually use it now, that's where you unlock a whole nother kind of step change in users and even more users. So I think that's kind of the business case for this, but the numbers are also pretty interesting. Here I'm looking at some comments from Itamar Golan. You should definitely follow him if you're on Twitter. I know I recommend a lot of people on Twitter, but really a lot of the discourse for AI happens there. So he says, it might be more efficient, cheaper, and faster, and so on, but I just tested it on 980 super difficult samples that I had on reasoning, coding, math, etc., and it was hitting much less than GPT-4, even though it's faster than GPT-4 Turbo. GPT-4 answers correctly on around 800 and GPT-4 on around 640. This is a 20% degradation, which is actually pretty substantial. Like on the LLM leaderboards, this would be like not even showing up on the leaderboard itself. So multimodalities are cool, and I think that's kind of another funnel that OpenAI is really intently exploring, especially to compete with Google Astra. But and low latency is also key. Like low latency is much more important, as pleasant as an interface as this is, especially if you've used some of the image generation ones. Like they're just more fun to use when the feedback is almost instant, and that's just a human thing. The big takeaway is it's faster, it's maybe cheaper, multimodalities are cool, but it definitely isn't smarter. And we've had a little bit more benchmarking just because it's been around for a little bit longer, and now we know a little bit more. Just so you guys know, this has basically been my experience with GPT-4o as well. Now, what's wild is when you start to think about GPT-4o on Grok coprocessors. So make it wildly fast, make it faster than anything else. And then the question is, where does the quality really start to become an issue? And I think artificial analysis, which again, you should also follow on Twitter, puts this brilliantly. I mean, they put it as GPT-4o breaks away from the quality and speed trade-off curve most LLMs follow. And although it's not the best LLM right now, but this breakaway is immense. So look, it offers basically the highest quality, by far the fastest, even without Grok. The speed, latency sensitive use cases where previously you'd want to use a really lightweight model are now far less compelling. Maybe they're compelling for on-device capabilities, but if speed is everything and you have a decently fast, kind of lightweight, capable internet connection, GPT-4o now replaces a lot of the novel capabilities of super small models like Phi 3 Mini. And previously, Grok was the only provider to break this curve using its own LPU chips. OpenAI has somehow managed to do this with NVIDIA hardware, and I assume this is just with a lot of dedicated hardware just for inference. There's a question of how did they do this? And of course, artificial analysis has some more information on this in just a bit. But the idea is that it's very similar to kind of these sparse MOE models we saw kind of in the last quarter cropping up, really similar to Snowflake's Arctic, and I'll link to our video above so you can check that out. And probably just vast improvements in data quality, and maybe some information coming from YouTube transcribed comments and transcribed just audio, because now clearly Sundar has caught on to the fact that they're doing that. This is a really interesting thing. And what I like here is this is over 14 days of measurements measured 8 times per day. So basically, instead of these other benchmarks that maybe rebench once every 2 days or once every week, I really like that there's now a really well kind of publicly available, publicly disclosed testing methodology that artificial analysis uses. And I also really like their graph here. So basically what they're showing, again, is this curve on throughput and relative performance. In the upper right-hand quadrant here, this is basically where we see the most impressive models forging ahead. Of course, Cloud 3 Haiku didn't really get a lot of attention, and I think it deserves much more attention. But you can see here that the first to break through were kind of LLaMa 3. We had DBRX way back in the day, which again, I think deserves more attention, and I'll also link to our video on DBRX. And what's interesting is you can see where, Mistral 7B, although it has greater throughput, which is here on the x-axis, its quality is much lower than a lot of these other models. And Arctic and Mixtral 8x7B are kind of great, relatively capable open LLMs that represent this quality, but GPT-4o is completely within a class of its own. And again, it's not the best, but it's getting there, and in theory, with more people using this, it will just continue to get better, which I kind of can't wait. And I'm going to link to artificial analysis below because they also have a lot of other really interesting benchmarks on their website. In closing, I will say that when we start comparing to models like Qwen 1.5 110B and their closed source and lesser known model Qwen Max, we start to see where GPT-4 has kicked off kind of an even new front in these open LLM, or just I should say LLM wars, since GPT-4o obviously isn't open. The gap is widening significantly, just like Maxime has said here, after their latest release, especially with new data from artificial analysis. Another model that I really want to take a look at that I haven't reviewed yet is Rika Core, which is another really interesting multimodal model that has a really impressive 128K token context window. It's interesting here because if we look at these models, even respective to GPT-4o, they're still significantly lower in terms of their capability. And what's interesting is we still see the curves of improving performance relative to kind of what OpenAI has done. And what you see here is when we look at closed source versus open source or open weight models. And what's interesting to see here is that for quite some time, the rate of improvement of open models and closed source models was actually pretty sparse. And what's interesting is there are two takeaways here. There's more convergence. In theory, I mean, there are ways to look at this where actually the rate of improvement in open source has been increasing at a faster rate than that of closed source. Now, of course, there's a question of how long this will keep up and whether or not we can really consider LlaMa 3 a truly open model, because we don't have much insight into how it was created, unlike a lot of the Mistral models. And of course, this would change entirely if overnight Facebook just decided they didn't want to actually release this. And of course, there's a lot of crosstalk when you look at big tech companies that release open source models between closed source models and open source ones. And we also have no idea which of these actually use synthetic data that may have been created from a closed source model to make an open source model better. So that all sounds very confusing, but the key is progress is still increasing, and I think it's pretty cool that GPT-4o has now set a really interesting benchmark to go for going forward. Now, I still like open source models. GPT-4o for me is kind of interesting. The assistant kind of application, it's never been that interesting to me. It's kind of cool, but like generally I just use coding models and I do a lot of summarization and kind of stuff with large text data sets, for those of you who are curious. So I'm curious, have you used GPT-4o? Do you think it's better than GPT-4 Turbo? Do you still only use open LLMs? I know kind of where I sit. I really like still using LlaMa 3 8B. I like a lot of the Dolphin fine-tunes from Eric Hartford. I still use GPT-4 and Claude for some coding stuff here and there. But let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.